This essay is going to be about the idolization of awful characters, villains, and treacherous people, and vengeful characters. We love them. We all enjoy them, probably. I really love seeing them on the screen or reading them on pages. It is a lot of fun. I've made it very clear several times on this channel that I love a good revenge story. The Burning series by Evan Winter is one of my favorite series that I have read in recent memory. I really enjoyed it. I love the vengeful character of Tao. However, I never idolize any of these characters that are evil or villainous, treacherous, or vengeful. I don't idolize them. I don't want to be like them. I don't look at qualities in them and think, yes, I would like to emulate that. And that is what I want to discuss today, is the people who do, because while it may come as a shock to some of you, there are people who do idolize these awful characters or view them as being righteous or on a path that is good. And that's what I want to discuss today, is why that happens and how it can be avoided. I was stunned when I learned that there were people who watch The Boys and root for Homelander, genuinely, not sarcastically or jokingly. They think that Homelander is just misunderstood or some garbage like that, or that his actions are genuinely justified, which is just wild to me. That seems like a really obvious villain, right? I mean, I think that the writers do a really good job of painting him as a horrible character. However, there are also ones that are more subtle who people tend to idolize, like Walter White from Breaking Bad or Ted Mosby from How I Met Your Mother. Yeah, I know that comes out of left field, but there's a reason for that, and I'm gonna get to that in a minute.
I'm Ted Mosby. And exactly 45 days from now, you and I are gonna meet.
Who are you talking to right now? Who is it you think you see?
Before we go any further into this essay, I would just like to give you a quick reminder about liking, commenting, subscribing. All of that helps to boost the video. I would really appreciate if you take a minute to do that, and let's go ahead and dive in right now. Throughout this video, I'm going to be using two different examples, two very polarizing examples, because one of them is extremely obviously the villain, and the other one is subtly the villain, and not everybody has realized that he's an awful character, and we're going to talk more about why that is later on in the video. The first one is, as you may have guessed, Homelander from The Boys. I feel like he's an extremely obvious villain, and yet there are still people who idolize him, so we're going to look into that. And the other example I'm going to use is Ted Mosby from How I Met Your Mother, because he's supposed to be the hero, he's the protagonist of the story, he seems like a good guy for the most part, and his quest is one that we can sympathize with, and yet he's also a terrible person, and I'm going to establish why very briefly in this video. So let's go ahead and start with why Homelander is horrible, which I think is going to be pretty easy to establish. Homelander is essentially the evil Superman of The Boys. He is the main antagonist and the big bad of the series. He's been established as someone who is maniacal and selfish, egotistical and narcissistic, as well as being emotionally stunted and having grown up with such a sheltered life that he is completely out of touch with reality. He has a wanton disregard for human life and views himself as superior to humans, really also as superior to Supes. He's always seen himself as the biggest and the best and the baddest. His desire for absolute mayhem and destruction is held back only by his greater desire to be loved. That's really his weakness, is that he wants to be loved and he wants to be appreciated. But if he lost that, he would kill everyone and destroy everything. That doesn't sound like somebody that you're supposed to really empathize with, does it? And now let's move on to Ted Mosby, whom you are supposed to empathize with. Ted Mosby hasn't killed anybody, at least as far as we know. He doesn't have a wanton disregard for all human life, but he does have a wanton disregard for the feelings of the people around him. Most of the time when we see him do something nice, it comes from a place of manipulation, especially when he's doing nice things for Robin. He's also conducted some of the worst breakups that I've ever seen. He also dismisses things very easily on his quest for love. He's always looking for a reason why this person may not be good for him. So he's a cheater, he's manipulative, he's cruel, and he is extremely egotistical. His endless pursuit of Robin, again, I mean endless, it goes through to the end of the series. He does not stop pursuing her, is awful to watch, especially if you are rewatching it and you understand that the two of them don't work together. But I'm not here to rant about the series, I'm just here to point out the fact that Ted Mosby is a massive jerk. There's still a website that was put up for their series called tedmosbyisajerk.com, and I'd argue that it still stands, even though that instance is referring to a time when Barney was impersonating Ted, not something jerkish that Ted actually did.
If you're here to ask me to take down the website, forget it.
What website?
tedmosbyisajerk.com.
You're right. I do deserve that.
He's not a good person. This is not somebody that we should be emulating either. So these are the two people that I'm going to be using as examples throughout the rest of this video, Homelander and Ted Mosby. So the question isn't, are these two people bad? I think that I've established that, but if you need further examples, or if you are just going to argue in the comments, feel free to let me know down below why you think these two people are actually the good guys. But in the meantime, I'm going to move forward with the assumption that these two people are awful, and you agree with that. And so let's move on to why in the world people might idolize the two of them or empathize with them to such a degree that they think that they are people to be emulated and loved. And now there may be an actual term for this, but I have coined my own, or maybe it's already a term, I don't know, but I'm calling it protagonist syndrome. Protagonist syndrome is when we look at a story and say, this person's the protagonist, therefore they're the good guy, they're somebody I should root for, they're somebody I should empathize with, and they are somebody that I should be emulating or looking for the good qualities in. We see somebody as a protagonist and we immediately assume that they are the good guy. Just because the character is the protagonist in the story doesn't make the character a good guy. But we might assume they're the good guy just because they are the protagonist, and that's what I'm calling protagonist syndrome. Now, I know that Homelander is technically the antagonist of the boys, but if you watch the series, there are many arcs in which he is the protagonist of his own story, and we see a lot of things from his perspective. And when you see so much from his perspective, you see him as a protagonist in those scenes. He's the good guy in those moments, and there are some scenes that are done so that you can kind of get a grasp on Homelander's psyche and where he's coming from, and for some people, that might be an even further cause for them to empathize with him as a character. So I'm counting Homelander as part of the protagonist syndrome because he has a lot of the qualities in his storytelling that we might associate with being a protagonist. So with protagonist syndrome, a viewer or reader may be unable to distinguish between what is universally good in the real world and what is good specifically in this instance for that specific protagonist. For Homelander, it is good that he kills people who lie to him. For most of us, if somebody lies to us, probably shouldn't kill them. No. Frank Castle straight up slaughters people, but technically he just goes for the bad guys who are probably going to be kicked out of jail anyway and are going to be back on the streets doing awful things, so it's a good thing that he did this, and maybe he's somebody that you think you should be emulating. Ted Mosby manipulates and mistreats women, hurts his friends, and is a narcissist, but he's on a quest for love, and it's kind of cute, and he also tells funny jokes every now and then, so, yeah, you know, he's a good guy, and we should be empathizing with him and maybe even trying to be like him. The thing is, and what I really want to differentiate here with protagonist syndrome, is that you can empathize with these characters. You can even empathize with Homelander to a degree, and I can say I understand why Homelander hates being lied to, hates being manipulated, hates having all these secrets kept from him. I don't agree with the fact that he goes around murdering everybody who happens to do him wrong every now and then, or just murdering people who annoy or frustrate him. I don't think that's okay. I don't think that's something that you should emulate, and I don't think that there's potential for him to be a good guy. I also empathize with Ted Mosby's quest to find the woman that he really loves. That's great. I don't think it's okay that he's going around manipulating and abusing people and pushing boundaries and being disrespectful and doing all of these other awful things that Ted Mosby does throughout the series. So I can empathize with him to a degree, but that empathy stops at a certain point, and I also don't want to be like him, and I don't think anybody should. It's all about recognizing the difference between being a protagonist and being admirable. The next 2 points that I'm going to make in this video are whose fault it is. Why is it that people might end up admiring somebody who's meant to be a villain in a story or who does awful things? And then next, how can we fix it? What can writers do to make sure that they've done their due diligence in order to ensure that people may not love their character so much that they decide that this character is fantastic and they love him and everything that he does is the good thing to do in that moment? So first, whose fault is it? Why does this happen? What causes protagonist syndrome in viewers and readers? Well, I think that the blame can lie with either the viewers and the readers or with the writer. And that's one reason why I picked How I Met Your Mother and The Boys as my examples, because each of them has someone different to blame. With How I Met Your Mother, I would definitely blame the writers for the fact that so many people seem to idolize Ted Mosby, whereas with The Boys, I definitely think it is a viewer issue because the writers did a really good job setting up Homelander as somebody who is awful and not meant to be emulated or put on a pedestal. In the case of Ted, his awfulness is frequently played up for laughs. Because you're supposed to be on his side, you don't really care about the people who are being hurt by him, you just laugh at whatever it is that he's done recently. Now, that's not all of them. Some of the things that he does are not played for laughs and they're played for awe moments, but they're not actually cute, they're creepy or just straight up immoral. Again, like his pursuit of Robin that is practically religious. And on top of that, when you put Ted next to Barney, Barney is a womanizing sociopath and Ted is I'm kind of like that, and he does some things with Barney that are very similar to that vein, but you're supposed to empathize with him more because he really just wants to find love while Barney is just looking for whatever his next conquest is, as he would put it. And so when you put the two of them next to each other, Ted really doesn't seem so bad. And then on top of that, everything that Barney does is also played up for laughs, although sometimes you're really just laughing at him, not with him, whereas with Ted, you're supposed to be laughing with him. So I think that that poor contrast between the two of them also helps to make sure that Ted looks like a really good person because, hey, at least least he's not Barney. But then when you put Ted next to somebody like Marshall and you really compare the two, Marshall is a great guy who loves his friends and loves his wife, and Ted is an extremely selfish person and is just genuinely terrible by comparison, and yet that contrast really doesn't happen as often as it should. And that's why I blame the writers for the fact that so many people seem to love Ted Mosby and idolize him, is that not only did the writers fail to point out how awful Ted is, but they didn't really contrast him with good characters nearly as often as they should have. Contrasting Ted with Marshall more often would have been a really great choice. We get a few key moments of this. One of them that I really like is when Marshall plays back voicemails that he got from Ted the night before when Ted was being truly horrible. It was the night of No Tomorrow, which I think was a St. Patrick's Day episode, and Ted is just going all out on his own awfulness, and Marshall sits him down and has him listen to these voicemails and just points out and highlights how horrible Ted really was.
You're turning into Barney. We don't need another Barney.
Look, it's St. Patty's Day. It wasn't as bad as it sounds.
It wasn't as bad as it sounds,
No.
huh?
That is a situation that should have played out way more frequently than it did in the series. I think I can count on one hand the number of times that something like that actually happened and Ted was called out for his behavior. He was almost never called out when he did something horrible, and in fact, we're just supposed to laugh with him, not at him, and then he doesn't really suffer consequences for his actions. And then let's look at Homelander. He straight up murders people and he fantasizes about destroying a crowd of people who just don't like him or are yelling at him. This is a bad guy. The writers did a wonderful job setting him up as a horrible villain, but they also set him up as a villain who has reasons for how awful he is. I mean, he was mistreated, he grew up in a lab, he was constantly lied to and manipulated by people. Like, he has been through quite a lot. That doesn't mean that he's a good guy, somebody to be emulated, or somebody who is even redeemable. I don't think Homelander can be redeemed. He is too far gone, he has done too much that is horrible, and he is continuing to be a manipulative psychopath. The writers did a really good job of establishing just how horrible Homelander is. Another good example of this is highlighting just how awful Butcher is, because Butcher is contrasted by Huey, who is referred to as his canary for a reason. Especially during season 3, in some conversations that he has with MM, he kind of indicates that he brought MM on to help to hold him back and help to hold the team together. And that's also why he keeps Huey around, which is very significant. Butcher wants to keep people around him to keep him in line so that he doesn't end up being a monster like Homelander, whereas Homelander wants to kill anybody who wants to keep him in line or hold him back. He hates them. It is this intense hatred that Homelander has for all of these people, and sometimes we see Butcher hating Huey or mistreating people who are holding him back, but eventually he comes back around and he figures it out. And that is a really good contrast for us to have, because Butcher isn't necessarily somebody to be emulated in all respects either, but there are some things that we should emulate from Butcher, like keeping people around us who ensure that the best is brought out of us rather than the worst. What I really enjoyed most about season 3's release was all of the people who suddenly realized that the show was mocking them and mocking their worldviews. They've been idolizing villains in real life for so long, and I think that's one of the key dangers of telling stories in a way that causes people to love the villain to such a degree, is that while it might seem ridiculous, that could translate to real life, and those people could end up idolizing real people who behave that same way, like people were feeling about Homelander. And that will actually bring me to my next talking point, which is how do we fix this and what are my recommendations? And my first example is how the writers fixed this in season 3 of The Boys, because some people somehow just weren't getting it. And that first recommendation is hyperbole. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia took a massive risk with its pilot. That first episode was horrible. It was divisive and disgusting and just had some of the worst characters ever. But it worked, and it worked because of how intense the hyperbole was. It was so hyperbolic, and there was nothing that you could see to redeem these characters. They were so over the top horrible that you knew these are not people that I should be emulating. I should not be putting them on pedestals. They are to be mocked, and I should be laughing at them, not with them. And that is what hyperbole does. You go to such an extreme that there's no way anybody can deny that your character is horrible and is awful. And I feel like they already did that with Homelander from the very first season onward, but in season 3 they went super over the top, not just with how awful he is to individuals, but just how awful he is in his own head and how completely messed up and psychopathic this guy is. He is out of his mind horrible, and they made it very clear with the hyperbole in season 3. They actually did a lot of hyperbole in season 3, which is why so many people felt like it was being a little more ham-fisted with its messages, but the problem is that it had to be because some people just weren't getting it. And apparently, very recently, people still aren't getting it, even after the 3rd season, which is just mind-boggling to me. Did we watch the same show? So hyperbole is a great way to ensure that people don't idolize your characters and realize just how horrible they are. Make them over-the-top awful, unreasonably and inhumanly disgusting. That is the best way to make sure your character is not going to be idolized. My next recommendation is contrast, and I already kind of touched on this, so I'm just going to be very brief here, but contrast means you have your awful character, but you also have a good character who is near them to help ensure that you realize who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. And they do a really good job with this with Huey and Butcher, between the two of them, and sometimes Butcher is corrupting Huey, but other times Huey is rubbing off on Butcher.
Hey, phrasing!
We have these contrasting characters, and even if they're on the same side, the way that we are looking at the two of them and the way they behave is so different that it helps to highlight how bad one person is. You put one character who is very evil and wicked next to a character who is very bright and happy and cheery and is doing everything they can to be the moral person here, you realize just how bad this other guy is, even if he's not doing anything that's super over the top, like lasering an entire crowd of people. With Homelander, we don't really have a lot of good people around him that we can contrast. We had Maeve and Starlight who were kind of helping, although Maeve particularly was kind of compromised, and Starlight didn't stick around for very long, and she didn't have a ton of scenes with Homelander that helped to contrast that she was a good person and he was an awful one. Another really good example of contrast is Marshall and Ted in How I Met Your Mother, as I mentioned earlier. What I think would have been good for How I Met Your Mother is if we'd had a lot of storylines in which Marshall is doing something really good on one storyline, and Ted is doing a similar thing in an awful way to show you that Marshall is somebody you should emulate, and Ted is somebody you should not. That's just my example of what a good contrast would look like. They don't even have to be direct contrasts, as long as it's very clear and the message is clear about who the real good guy in the situation is and who the bad guy in the situation is, even if the bad guy is your protagonist. And one last thing that I will recommend for making sure that the viewers know who the bad guy is confrontation. Now, that seems a little obvious, and I will agree that it can be a little ham-fisted, much like hyperbole, but if you do it right, it can make sense. A really good example of a great confrontation scene is the one I mentioned earlier, in which Marshall calls Ted out by playing back the voicemails that he got from him on the previous night. I thought that was a really good confrontation, and it shows just how bad Ted is. And having other confrontations throughout The Boys and throughout many other series helps to show you just how horrible some of these characters are. In Breaking Bad, Walter White is confronted by good people several times, and I feel like that was a good establishment that he was an awful person, and yet some people still missed the point. So it can happen no matter how ham-fisted you are with some of your confrontations. Sometimes people are just going to want to idolize your awful character, and it's going to happen, and there's only so much that you can do to prevent that. Especially if you are telling a story that is very subtle and nuanced and has gray morality, sometimes the viewers and readers just aren't going to get it. And that's okay, as long as you feel that you did your due diligence to ensure you told the best story that you could and made it as clear as you could what your message was. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video. I really appreciate it. I would love to hear your thoughts on what I've talked about here, and while you're down there, if you could like and subscribe as well, that would definitely help to boost the video and help to boost my channel. I look forward to talking about this with people who want to engage on the discussion. If you would like to see another video from me, you can do so by clicking up here. And until next time, bye.